greatest pleasure to introduce the second keynote speaker of this conference, Professor Christian Laes from the University of Manchester. Christian has studied classical philology at the universities of Antwerpen and Leuven and started a quite traditional, I would say, career in Greek and Latin, first at the University of Antwerpen and then at the Free University in Brussels, before joining in 2018 the University of Manchester as a professor of ancient history. The internationality of his career is not limited only to these stations in his life that I've already mentioned, but he has had in his career a huge amount of guest professorships in the most different countries, starting in Portugal, in Coimbra, then in Hamilton, Colgate, in Oslo, at the Open University in Nicosia and Cyprus, in Tampere in Finland, and in Vilnius. And more recently, also in Germany, at the University of Bonn. He's also been a senior research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Social Research at the University of Tampere, and he has also been at the Pontificium Institutum Altioris Latinitatis in Rome. And sorry, I forgot also the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, where you have also been a visiting professor. So you see someone who has really traveled across a lot of countries and has been researching and teaching throughout Europe and also over the boundaries of Europe. Christian has, I would say, three main research areas. The first one is disability history, which is the area from which the lecture that he will give tonight has been developed. The second one is Latin epigraphy, and more particularly he has published now lately, so in 2020, an important book together with Alfredo Buonopane with the title Grumentum, the Epigraphical Landscape of a Roman Town in Lucania. And the third research area, the first research specialization that he has is one I look at with great sympathy, which is Neo-Latin, and in particular the Latin production of authors from the 19th and even 20th century, among whom my beloved Giovanni Pascoli. So we will have to talk about that at a later point. From the incredibly long list of his publications, I will just mention the books and leave, of course, aside all the articles and chapters. And I will start with the latest publication, which is Disability and Healing in Greek and Roman Myth, which has appeared in this year, 2024, in the series Cambridge Elements. Last year, 2023, A Cultural History of Youth in Antiquity, which is, as is typical for the Cultural History series at Bloomsbury, the first volume of a 6-volume series about a cultural history of youth throughout the different periods of time. Actually, in the same series, he had already edited The Cultural History of Disability in Antiquity, which has appeared in 2020. I already mentioned the epigraphic book about Grumentum, but I would like to mention a couple of other important publications that he has edited and authored relating to topics such as family life in the ancient world. One very interesting and important book he edited together with Sabine Hübner in 2019 on single life in the Roman and later Roman world, but also Children and Everyday Life in the Roman and Late Antique World, co-edited with Volanto 2017. And then, of course, I think the two books which are most known and most read, which are Disability in Antiquity 2017 and Disabilities and the Disabled in the Roman World, A Social and Cultural History 2018. Children and family have been another topic that he's been investigating throughout his career. So another volume you might know from 2015 is Children and Family in Late Antiquity, Life, Death and Interaction. And I will stop because I could go on for the entire time of this lot by mentioning Christian's publication. Is a book that I use a lot that shows that he's also dealing with ancient economy, which is Work, Labor and Professions in the Roman World, that he edited in 2017 together with Koen Verboven. So, dear Christian, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for joining us today here in Potsdam. We are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Filippo, for this far too generous introduction. Thanks for the great organization, the great reception, the hospitality. So I'm really impressed to be here in this place of, let's say, Prussian grandeur, splendor. So it's an impressive place to have a conference, and I'm glad you're all here for this keynote lecture for today. I'm actually planning to do two things. So first of all, give a sort of overview of what has been done already in the field of disabilities and the disabled in the ancient world. And on the other hand, also offer a kind of prospectus of what I still intend to do in this field. And let me say also, as a sort of captatio benevolentiae, that I feel very humble being here in front of so many historians of other periods. Those of you not studying antiquity will sort of notice that in comparison with other periods, we sometimes lack the rich material you have for these other periods. And we just try to show how we as classicists and ancient historians try to make the best out of it. Okay, I guess you all have the handout, so this is basically the scheme I will follow, and I'll start with a perennial problem. How to define disability? Surely, how to define disability for the ancient world? Well, my answer will be very brief. Studying disability in the ancient world is always a sort of anachronism. Always. Inevitably. Why? Because I really believe, as so many historians do, that the concept of disability really came into being in the 19th century. Nation states, welfare states, sort of classifying their citizens, sort of making these distinctions, somehow paying allowances and fees for people who were in a certain category, and so on and so on. And that is just not there for, I'd say, the pre-industrial, pre-modern world, so not only for antiquity. And that makes any definition really incredibly tricky. One could say perhaps disabilities in the past were things that were innate, congenital, not necessarily so. Because of course, one can become disabled or impaired at a certain moment of his or her life. One could say, well, let's take employment, work, and professions as a sort of criterion. But that again is a very modern criterion. So the whole idea of getting fees and salaries for your work and allowances if you can't do the work and so on, that is of course not there for the ancient world. What about irreversibility? That is also a very difficult question. Sometimes people can cope with a condition, sometimes they will get better. You can, of course, be disabled for a certain time in your life and later on not so much anymore. So that's always a tricky criterion too. After so many years of studying this, I tend to look at disability in the ancient world as a sort of condition, either physical or mental, that puts you at a disadvantage compared to other people in your society. And I apologize for this very vague definition, but that is the closest I can basically get. I'm not too worried, though, about the anachronism. Why not? Let's just make a parallel with the history of sexuality. For the pre-modern world, and surely for antiquity, there wasn't even a word for sexuality. What about studying, doing the history of homosexuality in antiquity. There's plenty of books on this actually claiming that there wasn't any concept of homosexuality, but still you can study it. So I would say that we can basically do the same thing for antiquity, starting from what I mentioned in the fourth point of paragraph 1, a sort of practical classification, which is also being followed by present-day anthropologists. So when anthropologists now go to a certain society to study disabilities, they will do so mainly with a scheme which has the idea of from head to toe, or much more beautiful in Latin, of course, a capite ad calcem. So they will study mental difficulties, they will study the eyes, the ears, the mouth, then go through the whole body, then movement, of course, mobility, and then they have a sort of classification or category for all other sorts of disabilities, which can be very broad. And this is basically what I did in some of my books, some of my edited volumes, to basically look at these different categories. Again, knowing very well that there's always, inevitably, a sort of anachronism involved. Because, dear audience, there has been research on this. If you just go out on the street and you ask someone, what do you associate immediately with disability? What comes up now in Western society, contemporary society nowadays? It's two things. It's this, blindness, walking around with a stick, and it's the wheelchair. That seems to be the spontaneous connotation we have nowadays for disability, and that's why I chose this cover for my 2018 Cambridge University book. This actually comes from Spain, and we think that it was a sort of mime referring to and even ridiculizing somehow the Oedipus myth. So here is Oedipus. Obviously, it's a mime because there's the huge theater mask, and he's obviously depicted as someone finding his way through the streets by using this stick and also sort of trying to touch things. Okay. In 2007, 2008, when I started this research, one could say that this was kind of green grass. Kind of things which had not really been studied for the ancient world. By now, we have a whole network of people studying disabilities in the ancient world. So what I show you on this slide are just some of the most important books in the field. It all started in 1995, a book by my dear friend and colleague Robert Garland from Colgate University, North New York. The title says it all. The Eye of the Beholder. It's pretty much focused on physical disability, but it basically says that, well, the disability is really in the eyes of the people who look at you. They will judge you pretty much ad hoc also as being disabled or not so disabled. In 2003 came out the book by Martelin Rose, The Staff of Oedipus. Again, Oedipus on the cover. This is a fantastic book. It's on ancient Greece. It's mainly 5th and 4th century BCE evidence. And when I was reading this one years ago, I thought I would ever like to do the same thing for the Roman period. And that's the book you will find under there. So Disabilities and the Disabled in the Roman World, my monograph, which came out in English in 2018. But next to this, there's other work. This is already 1997, a very interesting monograph by Daniel Ogden from the University of Exeter, The Crooked Kings of Ancient Greece. There's a very strong tradition in Greek myths, Greek legends, if you want to, about dynasties even of kings, all facing a sort of disability. And specifically on this tradition is the book by Daniel Ogden. Very recent, from 2023, again focusing on the Greek world, is the book by Slusansky-Weaver on marginalized populations in the ancient Greek world. This is a monograph I would very much recommend too, because it sort of combines the perspectives of archaeology, osteology, bioarchaeology too, with the literary sources and the papyrological and epigraphical material we have. Now, next to my monograph, which you see in the middle of the slide below, I did some edited volumes also on this. So 2017 came out the Routledge volume, Disability in Antiquity, of which I'm still particularly proud. This was actually my research project at the University of Tampere, and there's 35 chapters here. And antiquity is really viewed as the longue durée. So the first chapter will be about Sumeria and Mesopotamia, and the last chapters are about early Islam. And it covers all these different regions. There's a chapter on India, there's a chapter on ancient China, and so on and so on. So the really very broad view of antiquity. And then in 2020, as mentioned already, in the cultural history of a series US cultural historians are all pretty much aware of. So the cultural history of disability, the first volume was dedicated to antiquity, and this was also a fantastic project to do together with many other colleagues, let that be clear. Only recently, so half a year ago, came out a volume on madness, between brackets, and this is supposed to be the very first volume that tries to touch the very difficult topic of what we would call intellectual disability in antiquity. Came out end of 2023. Okay. Right. Of course, I'm not going to read the definition aloud, which you will find on page 1 of the handout too, but there's just two things that struck me and that I wanted to make clear to you too. Here's the definition by the World Health Organization. First thing, the World Health Organization will pretty much focus that it is all on participation in society. This is what you read on the fourth line. Think about Robert Garland, the eye of the beholder. So how do people look at you? How do they want to get you involved in society or not? Which explains the very last sentence, which is the strong quote, of course, which I'd like to read aloud now. Disability resides in the society, not in the person. Society and person even written with capitals. This is how the World Health Organization comes to a figure, a number of 1 billion individuals facing disability all over the world, which makes something like more than 14% of the world population. But be careful with such a definition. This also includes all learning disabilities. This also includes all social disabilities, like, for instance, extreme shyness. It's all there. So if you include all this, you come with this figure, like more than 14% of the world population experiencing disability. Now, what about the ancient world? You could tell me, well, this is such a long tradition of classical scholarship, the Altertumswissenschaft that I admire so much. So you have everything, you have dictionaries, you have encyclopedias. So let's just get started, just find the right Greek and Latin words for disability and then just browse through the material. But that is not that easy. If you think about Greek words, there's words like adunatos, aphues, asthenes, aperos, and so on and so on. Well, they all mean something like weak, feeble, can also be sick, not well, in bad health. But that's it. That's, of course, not specifically disability. While for Latin, I'll just quote three. You have imbecilis, debilis, infirmus. Well, that's all very interesting, but that's not a 100% match with our disability. Did the ancient writers themselves not think about things like this? Well, every now and then. You could have a look at a subject like teratology. To teras in Greek means a monster, monstrum in Latin. What is a monster? It's something you can point at, something which is remarkable. So a weather phenomenon could also be a monstrum, by the way. So you will find some discussions, like, what about polydactyly? That is not such a rare condition. I found out that every 1 in 10,000 individuals has polydactyly. It means that you have 1 finger or 1 toe too much, so 6 on 1 hand. Right. The ancient writers recognized this. And you would have discussions like, is this a monster or not? The answer would be no. Because you still recognize the human individual. But there are some cases of such bad conditions that you hardly recognize it as a human being. That would be teras. That would be an exotic thing, a monster. But, so the ancient writers say, 6 fingers, well, you would just be recognized as a human being, so that is not a monster. There's another discussion, which you also find with the ancient writers, namely the difference between morbus and vitium. When I saw this for the first time, I thought, here I have it. Because, as most of you will know, morbus in Latin is disease and illness, and vitium is something like a defect, an impairment, something which is wrong. So, morbus is being ill, and vitium might perhaps be the disability. Well, not really. Because this discussion is only there with jurists, and it's only about compensation in the case of buying or selling a slave. This is a very interesting way of reasoning. What would they say? They would say, the jurists would say, morbus for a slave is a bad thing. It hinders his or her functionality. You can get compensation if your slave has a morbus. Vitium is just a minor defect. Now, you know how jurists are, of course. It's fantastic to read these sources. The discussions begin. What if you buy a slave to work on the land? Agricultural activities. And it turns out that he cannot say 2 or 3 words after each other without stuttering. Is this morbus or vitium? The jurist will say it's vitium, because you bought him to work on the land. He can perfectly do so, so you're not entitled to any recompensation. What if you buy a female slave? You buy her to do the household, but you also hope, of course, that she will become a mother and that there will be other baby slaves in your household. But it's always the woman to blame in these discussions. She turns out to be sterile. Is this morbus or vitium? How can you ever prove this? Some judges would say, yes, obviously, because you wanted her to have children, so it is morbus. The other judge would say, no, 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 you bought her to do the household, to be a cook or whatever, so the sterility is just vitium. So it's not at all what we first imagined, that morbus is like you having a cold, and vitium, you're not being able to walk. Not at all, and it's a distinction which is only made, once again, in juridic discussions on possible recompensation in the case of buying or selling slaves. Which brings me, dear audience, to a sort of paradox, which has been pointed out already in 1995 by Robert Garland. Garland will say the following: imagine us with our World Health Organization book, or website now, to the ancient world. We would find an incredible number of phenomena that we would now call disabilities. But if you transfer, let's say, an ancient Roman to our present day, and if he or she would be faced with our definitions of the World Health Organization, you would say, what is this? Why do you even think about this? Why do you even bother about this? So we would discover much, much more disabilities in the ancient world than they did, while they, coming to us, they would say, what is this? Why are you worried about this? It's not what I would call something disabling. It's an interesting thing, I think, to think about. So in my last thought, as a way of introduction and matter of terminology, would be, but I guess this is pretty much known with most of you, the distinction between impairment and disability, which doesn't work in every language, of course, but there one can say that impairment is the ethic thing. So to put things simply, in all cultures, you would have people not being able to see, not being able to walk, so that's just the ethic thing, impairment. While disability is the sort of judgment, the way society looks at this. And that is the emic aspect, so the view within, from within, while ethic is just looking at the society as a sort of outsider. I think in German you use Beeintrachtung, yeah, and these things is also, but it's very, not all languages have this difference between impairment and disability. Now, I was really happy to share a panel this morning, a panel in which we sort of also discussed reception of antiquity. Why do I show you this slide? Because I want to talk about exposure and infanticide of disabled babies, because of the fact that I have not one single picture, one single slide from antiquity that would be suitable. What you see here is early 15th century evidence, and it comes from the Ospedale degli Innocenti in Florence, which was, as you know, a hospital for babies who had been exposed. Just think about this. Early 15th century, Florence, of course, a profoundly Christian context. At a certain moment, about 2% of the population of Florence were babies and infants in this hospital. While many of these babies would not survive the first hours, of course. So it was already something when you managed to get into the hospital. So the amount of babies dying from exposure must have been much higher. And this was in a time where exposure was, of course, explicitly forbidden, according to Christian faith. What about antiquity? Again, reception is as important as the sources itself. The first text, which I quoted for you in full, is, I guess, one of the texts from antiquity that are quoted and used most. It's from the life of Lycurgus. It's by Plutarch. It is written in the 1st century CE about the founder of Sparta, who presumably has lived in the 7th century BCE. Yeah? It's like us writing about, let's say, the year 1400, something like this. So that's the first thing you need to think about. And it is, you can read it for yourself, it's basically about the famous test, or I'd have to say double test. It's about babies who, for one reason or another, and every word is important here, are ageneskai amorphon, which is translated as ill-born or deformed. Well, they are exposed, they are put apart in a place called the Lesche place in Mount Taygetus, close to Sparta. This is a well-known fact. If you read on what Plutarch says, he will also say that there's another test, a test being taken by the wet nurses. Okay, just a few thoughts about this. There's not one single piece of bioarchaeological evidence for this. So if the Spartans would have for centuries systematically exposed their deformed babies, one could expect to find perhaps something. There's nothing. Second thing to think about. Plutarch, who writes 600 or 700 years after the facts, fits into a sort of utopian tradition. A utopian tradition that made Sparta like the ideal state. In Sparta, things are organized much better. Things are not organized like in other states. You find very much the same tradition about Sparta with Plato and Aristotle. Another thing to think about, we know of some Spartan kings who, according to the sources, experienced a sort of difficulty or deformity which was there from their birth on. They survived, they became kings. So perhaps it wasn't that systematic. I'd say that this source is really a source which fits into this utopian tradition, this sort of admiring of Sparta too, but that it's very hard to make a point that this would have been happening for centuries, let alone in a systematic way. But next to this source, and next to Plato and Aristotle, who are not on your handout now, there's of course one text by Seneca the Rhetor. Many fathers, I'm just quoting from the pages now, are in the habit of exposing offspring who are no good, inutiles. Some, right from birth, are damaged in some part of their bodies. They are weak and hopeless. Their parents throw them out rather than expose them. This is the typical ancient language. So it's brutal, it's harsh. Projiciunt magis quam exponunt. And here's Seneca the philosopher, who in a treatise on controlling of anger, De Ira, writes as follows: unnatural prodigy we destroy. We drown even children, so it's obviously here about human beings, liberos, who at birth are weakly and abnormal. Again, I apologize for the language, but that's what the sources say. Debiles monstrosique. Yet, it is not anger, but reason, ratio, that separates the harmful from the sound. Unquote. So this is what Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, has to say about this. Now, this is all brutal. This is all harsh. Does this mean that when a baby was born with a disability, he or she would have had no chance to survive? Obviously not. I'll give you now some reasons to let the child live. This is a sort of exercise in what I'd call historical empathy. What if it's already the fourth baby, but at least the baby lives? As Filippo mentioned, I started as a historian of childhood. So if you look at ancient families, as a woman, you need to give birth to 6 or 7 children to have 2 surviving children. So infant mortality is huge. Okay, here's that baby. He or she doesn't look that healthy, but at least he lives. So let's see what happens. What if it is a boy? There's the expectation of having male offspring. Finally, a boy. Finally, a male baby. Let's keep him. Let's see what happens. But please also think about medical science. Philosophers, moral philosophers will tell you this. The responsibility that we put nowadays on parents is just enormous. I mean the responsibility from the moment that the baby is in the womb. Because we have this diagnosis, we can see, well, there's a danger that the child will have this, this, and this. Will you keep it or not? Of course, that wasn't there in antiquity. Even when the child is born with a sort of deformity, people could think, parents could think, well, it might get away. Perhaps things will get better. Just keep the baby. And please also think of the fact that some impairments are not apparent at all at the moment of birth. There are some people who are like 100% blind. They don't even see a fragment of light, but you don't notice it in the eyes. So this, of course, gets noticed after some months, but not right away. There was no testing like we do nowadays with babies just to see whether there's a reaction, so there's no testing for deafness. Of course, there was no testing for intellectual disabilities whatsoever. Well, anthropologists will tell you that infanticide is everywhere, but that pedicide, so this means killing the child after you have had it for, let's say, a year or a period of time, that this is very, very rare. So you sort of get attached to the child, and then you see, well, there's something wrong. You keep it. So these are all reasons why people with congenital disabilities could have survived. So there's plenty of evidence for this, what I've called in the slide on the handout, survival of the weakest. Absolutely, it's there. On the other hand, we should not be too optimistic either. Just think about the Florence example I gave. Think about what you read in reports of missionaries or also anthropologists. They will tell you time and again that when parents see that there's a serious problem with a baby, they just notice, well, we just can't afford this. Not even, we don't have the time to invest in the child. And then, this is a cruel thing to say, but mostly the baby is just put away and it dies in a few hours. So the actual action of really killing the baby, that is very hard to do for a human being. So what happens is that they just put the baby away. In a few hours, he or she is not there anymore. There's an excellent survey by Debbie Sneed, published in 2021, where she really makes the point that these people could survive. And I agree for 100% with her, but I think that sometimes she's too optimistic. There's also that dark side, which I just mentioned to you. So it is obvious, I guess, that there were many cases where people just could not afford to have this baby. And this is then what I've called in an article of mine, learning from silence. Because as you may imagine, this is a thing that people do not like to discuss in the literary sources. Okay. This is the survey or the article by Debbie Sneed, which got quite some media attention, as you see here. And also she starts with the fragment I showed to you, the biography, The Life of Lycurgus by Plutarch. Now there's one other reason why these texts, the text I quoted, are so important. That is, of course, for the use or abuse of these texts in the Nazi regime in the 30s. There's plenty of classical philologists who sort of with pleasure studied these texts, saying that the ancients too had a form of eugenetics. Adolf Hitler was an admirer of classical Greek sculpture. There were Nazi scholars sort of trying to cope with the difficulty that the proverbial wise man of the Greeks, namely Socrates, was actually ugly and had Semitic looks. How to cope with this? And in propaganda you find these things, of course. This is how it's going to end if you would let people of less value, minderwertig as they call them, procreate. But of course, these texts, these ancient texts, are not about eugenetics. Why not? Because eugenetics involves biology, involves the idea of race, which is a 19th century concept. So this was simply not behind these texts, but as you may imagine, these texts have been used and abused by medical doctors in Nazi propaganda. And it's always the same texts. So the ones I quoted, together with one by Plato and one by Aristotle. Okay, let's move on with my list, as I promised you. So the sort of treatment a capite ad calcem, so from head to toe. I was so pleased and also a bit jealous to see people presenting about wonderful micro-histories we just don't have for antiquity. But anyway, in this presentation, I will try to do some of these micro-histories. So for each disability, I basically focus on one iconic figure. And for mental disabilities, undoubtedly the most difficult disabilities to study for antiquity, I'd like to start with the Emperor Caligula. There's books on the madness of Caligula. Please do not take serious what I'm going to say now in the next minute. So don't quote me on this. If we would study Caligula as a present-day psychiatrist, with a diagnostical statistical manual, number 5 or number 6, as it is now already, what would we discover? So you can read together with me. This guy was obviously a sadist. So according to Suetonius, he tells his young wife, Caesonia, I would like to torture you to make clear how much I love you. He's a sexual pervert. He indulges in travesty, dressing up, can you imagine, as a Roman emperor, dressing up as a woman. He had all sorts of phobias. He was afraid of lightning. I have to say, I pretty sympathize with this one, but anyway. He had an addiction to sex. He just couldn't control himself in sexual matters. He would literally throw the money, the coins, out of the window of the imperial palace. He had all sorts of psychotic moods, and indeed, he also suffered from social disabilities because he was so ashamed of him getting bald on the top of his head. So he didn't even want someone in the theater sitting on the other row up to him, because then people could notice he's getting bald. By the way, I saw that there's a session tomorrow about baldness. Well, here's one case already with Caligula. Right, so please forget about these words of mine. But I was not really joking. Up to the 70s, this kind of retrospective and diagnostic approach has been taken. So there are really studies about what was wrong with this emperor, what was wrong with this emperor, and you get all these sorts of things which do not really make sense. What is interesting, I go to page 3, what is interesting, in my view, for a historian of disabilities nowadays? Well, first of all, that all authors, so next to Suetonius there are 3 others, that all ancient authors agree that actually this Caligula as a young prince and a young emperor did well. But then already in the first year of his reign, something happened. They mention something like a fever or whatever, and afterwards all went wrong. So this is an interesting idea. It is something that has happened to him on the way. And this is not opposite with the other approach. The other approach, which you find with Suetonius already, would say, when he was a baby, you could already notice that this was going to be a bad and evil individual. Because, dear audience, in the huge discussion about nature or nurture, most of the ancient doctors and philosophers always take the side of nature. You are just bad and evil because you were born like this. And in the case of Caligula, they would say, well, at a certain moment it came out. But it had always been there. So there is no ancient approach that comes close to the idea of trauma, psychological trauma for Caligula. Although he had a childhood, we could easily imagine to have been very traumatic. And you can study this, of course, but there's no ancient author saying that this was because of the fact that he had such a bad childhood that he became such a person. Speaking about categories, ancient doctors, of course, did not have their diagnostical statistical manual, but they discerned different things. They will talk about phrenitis. There's an excellent new book by Chiara Tuminger on this. So phrenitis is always something involving fever, and it's always a temporary thing. So you get seizures, attacks, but it goes away. The flute player is a wonderful example. So there's a person saying, stop, I can't hear it anymore. He's getting feverish. I can't hear this guy playing flute, and there is no music. So everyone is saying, what is the matter? Well, oh, the sound, but there is no music at all. Mania is the same thing, but it's permanent, according to ancient doctors, and it doesn't involve fever. And then there's the category, of course, of too much black bile, called melancholia or melancholy. This is the anxiety, the troubled mind, the man made out of clay who didn't want to get out of the house when it was raining because he believed that he would get dissoluted because of the rain. The man who believed that he was carrying the world on his back, who believed that he was Atlas. The man who sort of automatically or sort of obsession each single day at sundown would just stand up and sing a song like a cock would do at sundown, and so on and so on. So you find all these stories there. But every now and then, you find a passage like the one I quoted from Galen's De Locis Affectis, which is wonderful, because this is a sort of definition that comes close to our depression, which is, by the way, according to the World Health Organization, one of the most important disabilities of the present-day world. So I think I could teach a whole class just on the question, was there anything like depression in antiquity? Other categories would be morosis, which means that your brain cools off, and there you find texts about memory loss and even senility or dementia. And then epilepsy comes also close to the social aspect, because that is often called morbus comitialis, because as a Roman politician you don't want this to happen on the comitium. Everyone can see your epileptic seizure, and the most obvious example is there, Julius Caesar. Okay. Let's move on to blindness. Who is the iconic figure for blindness in antiquity? Of course, Homer. And it is true that my book was on the Roman world, but the sources I'm going to deal with here now, the so-called Lives of Homer, are actually 1st and 2nd century CE sources. So for the Romans, in the Roman world, Homer was as much a living reality as he was in the Greek world. Now this is really interesting. It will take you 2 hours, not more, to read these stories in translation. What do these stories tell us? Again, it's a double picture. So, first of all, they will tell us that Homer was not congenitally blind. That's an interesting thought. Why? Otherwise, how could he have described all these wonderful scenes of nature and colors? So, he cannot have been congenitally blind, so it must have happened due to an illness. Blindness didn't bring him much happiness. There were considerable problems. He often lacked, according to the Vitae, good attendance. It's mostly, and then anthropology comes in too, it's mostly children accompanying him. Children have nothing else to do, so they will just help the blind man. Sometimes he uses goats. He just leans on the back of the goats and just walks like this. Now, of course, literary historians among you would say, well, this is a reference to the Cyclops doing the same thing in the Odyssey. And that is true, of course, so there's that layer there too. But there's the idea of animals that can help you. By the way, this is a question that always comes, so I will anticipate already. There's no evidence whatsoever for antiquity on dogs guiding blind people, so it's not really there. So what can you do as a blind person? Well, you can be a poet reciting, you can be a teacher, or you can be a cobbler. Again, anthropologists will tell you, sort of jobs for which you need fine work with your hands are things that can be done also by people with visual impairment. Now, Homer, according to the story, will apply for public support, but he often gets cheated. Some states do not want to give him this support. Then he will curse this city-state, and so on and so on. So you see this. Sometimes he's being frowned upon by people meeting him for the first time. He's even plagiarized by another poet who thinks, haha, I will get away with this. So in sum, you see that he's pretty much integrated into the community. So he does what he has to do, but it is also a struggle for life. So when you read, no matter how you read these lives of Homer, I do not believe that this is on the blind, visionary seer who is exceptionally gifted because of his blindness. I would say despite of his blindness, he became such an important figure. So that is pretty much the thought which is behind this. On the other hand, I can never ever claim to discuss the condition of the disabled in ancient society, let alone the condition of the blind in ancient society. Why not? Because it depends very much on your network and on your status too. For instance, in juridic texts, it will be said that blindness and bad vision do not really matter. Why not? Because this was very much an oral society. So even as a senator, even as a magistrate, you could have slaves or other attendants bringing you to the meeting, and you could still do a speech, make clear your intentions, make a judgment. So mostly in the juridic text, it will be said, well, this is a thing that can happen, but it is not really an impediment. In the philosophical tradition, there's this idea of blindness will bring you to higher things. There's a remarkable anecdote with Cicero about a philosopher who turned blind, but he also was a womanizer, so he had many, many girlfriends. And one day his girlfriends were complaining, and they said, oh, this is such a pity that you are getting blind. And he says, ladies, why are you complaining? Don't you know that darkness has much pleasure in it? You should have known this and experienced this with me already. So that kind of jokes on the advantages of blindness. On the other hand, there's, of course, stories about the blind beggar and the idea that when you are without a familial network, things can be very, very bad for you. Let's move on from the ears to the, from the eyes to the ears and the mouth. This is one of my favorite stories. Why? I guess it was 2008 or 2009 that I lectured on this particular story with Herodotus. It's a story, you can read the fragments together with me, about the Lydian king Croesus, who actually had two sons, one of which was defective. For those of you who read Greek, ton houteros men dieftarto, since he was a deaf mute en garde kophos. It's a very Greek story. So you can imagine what happened. There was an oracle saying that the other, Attis, so the healthy son, that he would die by iron. Okay, you can imagine, of course, what happens. At a certain moment, he's a young prince already. There's a boar coming and sort of destroying the fields of Lydia. And he tells his father, look, father, I'm the prince. I will go hunting this wild animal. No, says the father, do not do this, because you will be killed. No, father, a boar doesn't have any iron, so why would I not do this? The father is begging. Here's the second fragment. Please, son, do not do this, for you are in fact my one and only son, inasmuch as I count the other indeed, since he is defective, not to be mine. So the Greek says, dieftarmenon ten akoen, so with problems defective in his ears, I do not think him to be belonging to me. Uk enai moi logizo mai. Of course, the son goes. And you can imagine what happens. This is a truly Greek story. There's another hunter throwing the spear at the boar, missing the animal, hitting Croesus' second son, who immediately dies, as the oracle had said. Now, as you may know, later on, Croesus, in one way or another, will sort of destroy his own empire by fighting the Persians. When he is in the capital of Lydia, namely Sardes, he's just sitting there utterly depressed. Everything is lost. He lost his son, he lost his reign, he lost his empire. And there's a Persian soldier coming, looking at this old man who is sitting there, who wants to just kill him. And suddenly there's a voice calling, don't do this! He's my father, he's the king! And that was the other son. So suddenly he starts speaking. Mind that even then his name is not mentioned. Okay, the Persian king says, well, now we have him. Here's the king, here's King Croesus. We'll put him on a pyre. That is what's happening here. And sitting on the pyre, Croesus is reflecting about his own life. There's my third fragment, in his bygone well-being, Croesus had done everything for the boy. He had thought up other plans, and especially to Delphi, he had sent men to consult the oracle about him. If you're too much worried about the fate of Croesus, this Greek story, he won't die, because rain will come and the rain will just extinguish the fire, and then he becomes the advisor of the Persian king. Anyway, when I was lecturing about these texts, I had a student of mine whose second father, his stepfather, was actually Albanian. And he told me, he said, well, Professor, what we are reading here is actually what I would imagine happening now in Albanian villages. That is, if you have a house where, let's say, there's a couple with 3 children, they would tell you, we have 2 children. The whole village knows that there's a 3rd child, but the 3rd child has a disability. He's not or she's not really counted. But everyone knows. It's just a thing you do not mention. Well, told this student to me, and I checked it, and you find it with anthropologists, this does not mean, I stress this does not mean that these parents do not care about this 3rd child. Like Croesus. Yeah? So they will take care of him or her, but it's just a thing you do not like to discuss. So what we would automatically consider as neglect is not necessarily always the case. Same for the juridic sources. If you read them about the social and juridic implications of being deaf-mute, it's nuanced. This is an oral culture. So if you can't speak up as an aristocrat, this is very bad. But on the other hand, if you, for some reason or another, are not able to speak anymore at a certain moment of your life, there's always the possibility of writing down your will, your testament. So again, I cannot say that the condition of deaf-mutes was worse or better in antiquity than in other periods, it's a pretty nuanced picture. Okay, the mouth. Let's go to page 4, speech impairment. Here's my microhistory for this chapter. This is Demosthenes. I do not know whether this works for Google in German or in English, but when you do the Dutch Google and you type in Demosthenes, the first thing that appears is an association for people dealing with or facing speech impairment, stuttering. So he became iconic for this. Pretty interesting. When you carefully read all the ancient texts, there's not one ancient text saying that Demosthenes was what we would call a stutterer. It's more about the victory over yourself. It's more about a young man who, as a politician, has to speak to the Athenian assembly. And as you know, Greeks are never silent. So you can imagine, of course, how to do this, to speak to an assembly without a microphone. It's about this. We know that Demosthenes fought his tutor in court and that he pled his own case. How would he have done so if he was really what we would call a stutterer? So there's nothing like this. But look at the King's Speech movie. Demosthenes is there. Reception of antiquity again. The pebbles, the stones, put in your mouth. And just try to speak with pebbles in your mouth and try to do this in a noisy environment, in the case of Demosthenes on the beach. So he became kind of iconic for speech therapy, though the ancient texts do not mention him as a stutterer. I could tell the same story about Moses. Moses, in the Old Testament, says, "I'm a stutterer in the face of God," which is a metaphorical thing. And there's a whole Jewish tradition on him being a stutterer, but it's not really in the original texts. Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, could not control himself. When he was angry, he foamed and he stuttered. But that's not the same, of course, as what we would call a stutterer. Okay, so I have a whole chapter on this too, and then you suddenly come across a text as the one early 5th century by Caelius Aurelianus, which is so beautiful that I just offer it to you on the handout. I'm not going to read the whole thing aloud here, but this is really about what we would call speech therapy. He says, as a doctor, I have people facing difficulties with this. I have them come, and I have them start with words like paian. Ah, yeah, that's easy. You don't ask them to pronounce strepho or something in Greek, because that would be too difficult. And then you would just teach them how to count. Look at the King's Speech, same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so on. Then you sort of give them simple words which they have to shout. And afterwards we offer them the exercise of reciting and discussion. I don't really know what I have to imagine by this, but it is there. It's a unique document. We hardly know anything about Caelius Aurelianus, who lived in North Africa, Numidia, beginning of the 5th century. But he is an author, a medical doctor, who sort of recognized this condition, which he calls ischo or ischnophonia. He writes in Latin. He uses the Greek word, but Caelius Aurelianus writes in Latin. Let's move on. Another microhistory, one of my favorites, about mobility impairment. This is Philip of Macedonia, father to Alexander the Great. Here's a story, here's an anecdote that you find with many ancient writers, also said about other individuals. So Philip had a limp because of what we would call a war wound. And the text says that he was utterly ashamed of this, that he didn't want to appear in public anymore. At which his son Alexander says, "Father, go out in public, and with every single step you take, people would be reminded of your great virtue." This is wonderful. There's mostly American scholarship on the ambiguity of watching war veterans in ceremonies, processions. It's the same thing. It's not a thing you really like to see because you see the suffering. At the same time, you are reminded, of course, of the great courage, of the great virtue of these people. Okay? In this chapter, I did a lot with osteology too, and this is a point I want to make strongly too. So we have discussed during the conference already the community concept. So I agree for 100% that people with disabilities were often much more integrated into the society than they are nowadays. But at the same time, this also involves suffering and harsh labor. Because sometimes you just have to do the job, even when it's very painful. So we have discovered bones of people who must have suffered a lot, a biological reality, and at the same time you can see that they have done harsh physical labor for the most of their lives. So the community concept is not always, or not necessarily always, something positive. Can involve both too. This is another thing I'm going to elaborate on now, but speech 24 by Lysias is a famous example of a so-called, perhaps crippled, which is again a word I wouldn't use anymore now, but a so-called crippled person who, who asks, of course, for an allowance from the Athenian city-state, and he's sort of suspected of trying to cheat and getting an allowance for unjust reasons. Okay, here's number 9, iconography of disability. Let me first of all say that I did not want to have any of these pictures on the cover of my book. Why not? Because they belong to a very specific tradition, which is a tradition that comes up in Hellenism, which is the tradition of the monsters. These are basically little statuettes you can have in your house, in your place. It's much about humor, it's much about surprise, the unexpected. If you look at the dwarf on the left, the joke, of course, is on the proportion of the membrum virile. If you look at the right, he looks like Hadrian. It's a philosopher, and then you see the deformation on the chest, and so on and so on. There's hundreds of pages being written about statuettes like this. It becomes fashionable in Hellenistic times and in Roman times. There's many theories. Some say that this is about apotropaic things, so just warding off the evil eye. Some say that it is about emphasizing your wealth. You say, I am not like them. They have to come to my house to beg, but look at the person I am. Recently, there has been an excellent book, by the way, which stresses the sort of celebration of diversity, saying that this is sort of opposition against these classical sculptures with perfect bodies. So a whole stream saying, well, there's different human beings. Life can have its surprises. So that's all possibilities. This is fascinating. I hope it still survives because it's in Antioch, Antakya, and you know about the terrible earthquake that happened like 1.5 years ago. This is fascinating. Yeah? He is staring at us. And he says, Kai su, you too. So if you want to mock me, remember that you are a human being too, and it can happen to you too. So please do not laugh too much about my or with my disability. Or this is also a famous case, so all sorts of theatrical masks, which also somehow show disabilities. So again, if you have a look at my handout on page 4, I am not claiming that the ancients, whoever that may be, would have had dread, pity, fascination, mockery, and disdain towards the disabled. I just say that in certain sources, you find these feelings expressed. and explicitly being expressed. So we will explicitly will say, well, or authors will say, well, in order to ward off the evil eye, you need to have a sort of depiction of a disabled person. Or the idea which comes up in the Christian sources, for instance, culpability, guilt. If you have a deformed baby, it is because of the fact that you had sex on a holy day, and so on and so on. So these things are there. There's interesting remarks on pity. So some authors would say, why do you give money, or why do you give something to a disabled beggar? This is because you imagine that it could have been you. And this is actually why you pay. Then there's the whole idea, of course, of fascination. So the markets which were there, with the so-called freak shows. And we need to be honest about this, there's lots of mockery too. Cicero himself writes about an opponent who suffered from gloire, which means that you have like a swelling here on your neck. And he says it's a good joke to call this opponent a swollen orator. And one day he comes to the Senate and he said, it took me an hour to get here because I also had a mobility impairment. And Cicero says, I didn't know that hours had become so long. Ha, ha, ha. And he says that this is an appropriate joke you can make. It's in his handbook on oratory. I once had a student who worked on disability humor with Marshall. Marshall can be very cruel in sort of jokes about disabled people. And this student of mine interviewed some stand-up comedians, contemporary stand-up comedians, and asking them, would you laugh with this? Would you mock this or not? And then you could see also with these comedians a sort of tendency towards not doing this anymore, while they would have done so 20 years ago. So there's quite some cruel mockery in the ancient sources, absolutely. Also this of course, again, the idea of warding off the evil eye, again saying kai su, and here you see the evil eye, and you see the evil eye attacked by all sorts of animals, like a scorpion, like a dog, a cat, a bird, and even a knife coming in. So this is the idea of warding off all the evil. This again comes from Antakya, and this was the cover of my 2017 volume. I promised also to give you a sort of conspectus of what is going on in the field and what might be the future of this research, pointing to some excellent volumes, let that be sure. So there's, first of all, the approach by Caroline Husquin. Her book in French is called L'intégrité du corps en question. This is really interesting. So she will say, okay, there is no disability, there is no concept of disability, so let's study integritas, integrity in antiquity. But this is huge. I'd say, so I've written quite a long review on this book, I'd say that it's excellent, but it also makes the topic endless. Because one could easily say that being a woman, according to Aristotelian categories, is also a sort of disability. Because women, according to Aristotelian thought, do not have the integrity that men have. What about kinaidi, passive homosexuals, or castrated people? Would you count them also as not having integrity? Is that a sort of disability? What about people of color? In certain cultures, that can be, unfortunately, a disability. What about old age? So these are all things which are included by Caroline Husquin. Interesting, really interesting, but it makes the field very, very wide. There's also studies on, the Christianity, or the factor of Christianity coming in, by Candida Moss on divine bodies. This is pretty interesting. The thought that we will all, at Judgment Day, rise with perfect bodies. Does that involve a sort of ableism? Does it mean that the perfect body is the ideal thing? Maybe. But you could also say that it means that in the face of God, my or your disability does not really count. If I lose a hand, I will have both of my hands at Judgment Day, so you could also interpret it as that Christian is there with two hands, no matter whether he lost it or not. So the argument goes both ways, I think. What about the thesis, quite provocative, by Megan Henning, Hell Had No Fury? So she will basically say that in hell, and this starts already in the sort of apocryphal, apocalyptical tradition, the bad guys in hell are deformed. And this goes up to the Divina Commedia by Dante. Yeah, that is all true, but would that make that Christianity somehow to blame for a sort of negative image of people with a disability? I would be very cautious with using this argument, because on the other hand, one could say too that, well, basically Christianity is a religion which very much also honors suffering, and which in a way even worships mutilated bodies, suffering bodies. Think about the case of the martyrs. And what to do with, this could again be the topic of a whole class, with the idea of charity and the fact that institutions for the blind, for orphans, for the weak, for the old, and so on, really come up in late antiquity. That is a factor that needs to be taken into account too. Quite a radical book, but again, a very interesting collection is the one by Ellen Adams on disability studies and the classical body, The Forgotten Other. It's very much focusing on what I mentioned already in my introduction, the idea of sculpture, showing ideal bodies, and that being emphasized also in our museums. But again, on the other hand, there's a whole tradition also of celebration of diversity, I'd say so, in classical art. Now, there's a few really promising projects also coming up or being there already. This can easily be checked on the internet. If you just Google the Votives project, you'll find it immediately. This is pretty much on agency. So it is studying sanctuaries, the environment of the sanctuary. How difficult was it to access this sanctuary? How could you, for instance, if there's an inscription for a person who could not walk anymore, how did he or she get there? Which votive objects are there? Are these mainly wombs? Then it means that there were women going there for matters of sterility. Or is it mainly eyes? Does that mean that visual impairment was the main thing people cared about? Does this relate to certain sanctuaries? And so on and so on. There's thousands of these votive objects, and they need to be studied. And perhaps in this way we come closer to agency of the disabled. This is also enormously interesting. When I do talks like this, and I've basically done them all over Europe and even on other continents too, one of the questions always is technology. Wheelchairs, no. There were no wheelchairs in antiquity. Dogs to help the blind, no, there were not really dogs. But were there some things? Well, my answer is always yes, ad hoc. So there was no industry, no production of it, but sometimes they realized that it helped, for instance, to put a person who could not walk on a cart and just drive him around. They realized, for instance, also that if you use certain gems, you can use them to amplify images, and it can help to read. There were no glasses. That is, again, I think it's early 14th century invention. But sometimes they knew that this stone could help to make the reading a bit easier. Prosthesis in antiquity is a huge field. And the specialist there is my dear colleague from Glasgow University, Jane Draycott. She has this book and another one too. So yeah, every now and then, in graves, you find things that look like prosthesis. And you find literary sources also on a wooden leg, for instance. So yes, people make the best out of it, and they sort of are helped by technology, sometimes also, as I mentioned, in the case of Homer or the Vitae of Homer, by animals. Just at the bottom line of page 4, I mentioned the richness of late antiquity. That is a dream of mine that hopefully once will come true. If you look at hagiography, miracle stories of the 4th, 5th, 6th century, what you get there for the first time are local traditions. You will get these stories in the Latin West, in Latin. You will get the Byzantine material in Greek. You will find the tradition in Coptic Christianity. You will find in Amharic language, so for the Ethiopian tradition. You'll find Syriac, Aramaic material. You'll find Armenian material, even early Arabic material, and so on and so on. So these things have never been compiled. This needs a team of people, of course, because I, unfortunately, cannot read all these languages. But you could basically see that there are different traditions focusing on different disabilities and pretty much focusing on agency, too, because there are no stories, speaking about microhistory, so rich as miracle stories for studying the agency, the daily life also, of disabled people. And this is also another approach which comes close again to the Votives project. This is again a bit like a provocative but excellent article by Debbie Sneed on ramps in ancient sanctuaries. And she has made the point that probably, I would be a bit more cautious with the argument, that probably these ramps were also used to enable access to people who sort of experienced difficulties with mobility. Okay, if you just have a look at page 5 of the handout, then I just mentioned the website which brings together basically all scholars in the world dealing with disability in the ancient world. I run I have a running bibliography there, so I just sort of put a new version on it like every single year, and I think we have about something like 1,000 titles now already. So the field is really expanding, and please feel free to become part of this community. So basically all news on this research topic is there, and a bit immodest. I apologize for it, but I also advertised my new book, which just came out a few months ago. So some scholars have said, well, you need to focus more perhaps on the role of religion and disability. Can priests be disabled? Can gods be disabled? And that would be the subject of another talk, which I will gladly do in different places in the next academic year to come. Thank you for listening.